Good evening, everyone. My name is Audrey Davis, and I'm the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum. And I want to thank you for attending tonight's program, which is sponsored by the Alexandria Black History Museum and the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project. Both organizations support and promote Alexandria's vibrant African American history. We are so pleased that you are with us today for our lecture with Dr. George Musgrove on his book, Chocolate City. This evening, it gives me great pleasure to introduce George Derek Musgrove. He is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is the author of Rumor, Repression, and Racial Politics, How the Harassment of Black Elected Officials Shaped Post-Civil Rights America. And this is by the University of Georgia Press, published in 2012. With co-author Chris Myers Asch. And he's also the author with co-author Chris Myers Asch of Chocolate City, which he will be talking about tonight. And Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, was published by UNC Press in 2017. His latest project is Black Power in Washington, D.C., a web-based map of Black Power activism in the nation's capital between 1961 and 1998. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, National Public Radio, the New York Times, and The Root. He earned his PhD from New York University in 2005 and now lives with his wife and two sons in Washington, D.C. It gives me great pleasure to introduce George Derek Musgrove. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, and thanks to everyone there for having me and for coming out this evening. What I'm going to do is speak for approximately 25 minutes and then open the discussion up to questions. When Chris Myers Asch, my co-author, and I do these events, we much prefer the question and answer and the exchange that allows us to have with readers. And so I'm going to try and hurry through this presentation, not too fast, and get to the question and answer. So I'll, of course, be talking about Chocolate City, my co-authored book with Chris Myers Asch, which came out in 2017. And this was a wonderful picture that someone actually sent to us during the protests this past summer after the murder of George Floyd. What I'm going to talk about tonight are really four things. First is just to give you all some idea of how we came to write the book. I am not a DC native, and so it wasn't a natural for me to write this book. Chris is, and so to a more of a degree it was for him. I'll talk about why we called it Chocolate City, and there's actually a pretty dense argument behind the name. Next, I'll talk about why DC history matters and why I think DC history matters not just to folks in the city or the immediate area, but to the entire nation. And then last, I'll give you my favorite story, at least the one that I'm clinging to this week. And based on the events in the House of Representatives, you of course know that story is going to revolve around statehood. And because of who I'm talking to, it'll also revolve around the issue of retrocession. Really quickly, before I move on from this slide, I just want to point out to folks that there are a couple of different ways you can sort of pick up this history. There's, of course, the book itself, which is out in hardback and paperback, and I encourage you to pick it up at your local bookstore. But there's also an audio book. The folks at Tantor Media were kind enough to approach us not too long ago. And the audio book is out, read by David Zadzin, and he actually does a wonderful job. And then for those of you who really want to dig deep into the Black Power movement in the city, I encourage you to check out Black Power in DC. The website address is right there at BlackPowerinDC.umbc.edu. And it's a free website with approximately 50 historical photographs and a tremendous amount of text to sort of give you an in-depth look at the Black Power movement. But let's get into an actual discussion of Chocolate City. We'll worry about that website later. So Chris Myers Asch and I, and Chris is pictured at the bottom of the screen speaking with me next to him, met at the University of the District of Columbia in 2010. I had been at the university for about 4 years. Chris just arrived that year, and we ended up really becoming close. And primarily that was because much of the faculty at UDC was a great deal older than us. UDC had sort of an odd set of hiring waves. And we were really kind of the second in the city's, in the university's history. And so most of our peers in the department had been hired in the 1970s. And so, we gravitated towards each other because of our age, but also because Chris had worked in the Freedom Schools. The Freedom Schools are sort of an activist educational model developed by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi in the mid-1960s, and it very quickly spread across the entire US, including a couple of freedom schools here in DC. I had actually worked at the Sojourner Freedom School here in DC. Chris had founded a group called the Sunflower County Freedom Project in Sunflower County, Mississippi. And so we bonded over that as well. And first time we really sat down and got to hang out, I'm a lover of self-deprecating stories. And so I told Chris this very embarrassing story that had just happened to me the year before in 2009. And UDC at the time had this absolutely horrible policy. And that was that if you signed up to teach a class, then in that class does not fill, it doesn't get the requisite number of students, that class is canceled on the first day and you are assigned a new class. And so when I was teaching at UDC, I was a historian of contemporary US and African-American politics. And so that's what I taught, US history, African-American history. I had 4 classes in 2009, the semester I was talking about, and one of them didn't fill. And so my chair called me into her office and said, I got to cancel your class. And I understood that, but I was kind of hoping, because I didn't really understand the policy, that maybe I just got a little bit of time off. She's like, and of course, now I have to assign you a new class. And my mood, of course, changed very quickly. The new class that she assigned me was DC history, because it was the only one left. And I protested. I said, I do not know anything of any substance about DC history. I learned a little bit about Walter Fauntroy and Marion Barry for my first book, but I really didn't know much about the city's history. And she, she sympathized, and I protested some more, and she sympathized some more. I protested even more, and she finally just leaned in and said, you should really head home and start reading, because class is tomorrow. And I thought that was a hysterical story, right? Not only had I sort of been made fun of by my chair in that moment, but I go into the class, and I'm telling Chris about this, and my students are jokers. I mean, they're absolute jokers. They're asking me about all of these conspiracy theories about the city's history. One of them came in one day and said, isn't the streetscape of the city sort of laid out like a pentagram because the designer of the city was a Mason, and the Masons are devil worshippers? And I was pretty sure that wasn't true, but I always had to go home and do all this extra research because of this little group of students who would force me through this. And it's a very funny story. Chris sat there stone-faced. And I was genuinely annoyed with him, because I thought, when I give a good story, folks should laugh, right? Turns out Chris was very moved by the story, but it really reminded him of something that was just not funny. And that was that when he was a freshman at Wilson High School, because he is a DC native, he walked into his DC history class. It was required in freshman year then, now it's required senior year. And his teacher just said, look, I know we're supposed to spend half the year on DC history, half the year on world history, but DC doesn't really have any history. So what we're going to do is spend just 6 weeks on DC history and then spend the rest on world history, which is much more important. And, Chris, being a DC native, was insulted, but he was also 14 years old. And so he just didn't know how to push back against this teacher's dismissal of his city's history. And so he stewed on it for years, quite literally until the time that he met me. And when I told him that story, I sort of ended it by saying, God, I wish I had had a really good single volume that I could have assigned to the students that had really good stories and that really dealt with the issue of race a little bit better than some of the textbooks that were out there at the time. And he just said, yeah, somebody should write that book. And then, sat there stone-faced and disappointed me. But a week after that conversation, he sends me an email. It's got a big fat book proposal in it. And he writes at the top of the email, we should write that book. And lo and behold, 10 years later, we have not only written that book, but are in fact still talking about that book a great deal. And I'm quite happy that that is the case. Now, I want to talk really quickly about the context in which we decided to write the book, because when I got that book proposal from Chris, it was obvious to both of us that large numbers of DC residents would be open to reading this book. We didn't think as many as have actually bought it, and we're really, proud of the fact that folks think it's a good book. But we knew that there was a market out there. And the reason was because DC was changing rapidly. In fact, the entire metro area was changing rapidly in 2011, 2012, when we began work on the book. Just in 2011, the year that we had that conversation, or at least the year that I accepted, Chris's challenge to write this book with him, the city lost its Black majority for the first time in a generation and a half. And that was primarily because huge numbers of African Americans were moving out of the city and into Prince George's County, kind of joining a migration out of the city directly to the east that had been going on pretty much without ceasing and since the 1970s. And today, Prince George's County actually has double the number of African Americans as does the district. The other part of it was that there's two reasons that Black people were moving out of the city. I mean, one is that they actually wanted to go to nice places with a patch of green and good schools and pretty houses, right? They wanted the suburban dream of the suburbs. But the other reason was that significant numbers of people were being pushed out. Poorer people primarily were being pushed out because of gentrification. DC was one of the most hyper gentrified cities in the entire country in 2013, where you see that Washington Post article, March of the Millennials, on your screen. And we knew, because of what was happening in the city, that there were older residents who wanted their story to be told before it kind of was pushed away. And the communities that held those stories and that experienced those stories were displaced. And we also knew there were newer residents who really didn't know what they were getting into and wanted to understand it. I mean, they would, we'd meet people and they'd say, I don't know why my Black neighbors are mad at me, but they are, and I need to understand the background here. And so that sort of movement of people, that churn that was happening right when we started the book, made it so that we knew we could actually speak to a large number of DC residents and suburban residents, quite frankly, and fill a need that they had for a book like this. And by the way, the last time someone had written a big comprehensive study of race in DC was in 1967, when Constance Green had done so in a book called The Secret City. 1967 is before the revolt of 1968. It's before most people in DC knew who Marion Barry was. And so we thought that, it was time to sort of update that study. And I should point out that aside from just people moving around, I mean, they were arguing about who owned the city, how important history was in making those claims of ownership. And it played out in the pages of The Atlantic, of the Washington Post, of the New York Times. You'd literally have people writing articles back and forth about bars on U Street. And then it blew up from there into discussions of gentrification and history. And so we knew that people were serious about this. They cared about this. And we wanted to make sure that we could give them some historical background to inform those discussions and maybe even bring down the temperature a little bit. Now, one thing that we knew we didn't want to do when we decided to write this book was we didn't want to write just about the African American community in DC. There's no question that could fill a book. Maurice Jackson at Georgetown University is in fact writing about the Black population of DC right now, and I'm very excited for his book to come out. But what we were interested in was, sort of a question that sort of went beyond the borders of the district. And so what we really wanted to do was write a history about race and democracy in the nation's capital. Now, by race, we meant race as sort of a social construction, and all different racial groups have a race. And so we wanted to write about poor whites who had been left out of the story of DC, the Native Americans who had by and large not been incorporated into the story of DC, And of course, the African-American population, but particularly the African-American population that had seen less attention in the story of DC. And so particularly working class African-Americans in the 19th century. And so we got all of that into the book. And for those of you who've already picked it up, you'll know that the first chapter actually starts with the Native American population that occupied the area that is now the district, the Nakostan, who used to have the center of their village not too far from the center of Bowling Air Force Base on the Anacostia River. Now, where did we get the name for the book? And why did we choose the name? After Chris and I decided that we were going to do this book together, we had a conversation that was probably about 15 seconds long about what we wanted to name the book. And I think the way it went was, I'd like to name it Chocolate City. This was me speaking. And Chris said, that's a great idea. And I said, you sure you like it? He said, yes. We were done. We were done with the conversation, right? What he knew and what I also knew was that Chocolate City was the official name, the unofficial name for the city for the greater part of about 40 or 50 years. Most people outside of the district knew the name from the Parliament Funkadelic album from 1975 called Chocolate City. And the title track for the album was, again, called Chocolate City. And aside from P-Funk being the best funk band in the history of the world, they also had a very clear analysis of what was happening in DC and how it reflected what was happening around the rest of the country too. What P-Funk knew, because they had a huge and enthusiastic fan base in the district, is that DC was, in 1975, one of the blackest cities in the country. It had a 73% Black population. It was also the first major American city to gain a Black majority in 1957. And people had been using the nickname for the city since at least the mid-1960s. People literally just started saying it on the streets, got picked up by local disc jockeys on WTOP, not WTOP, what later became Radio 1, pardon me, Kathy Hughes Network. And then P-Funk picks it up and sort of makes it more of a national nickname as opposed to a local nickname. And what P-Funk was referring to when they used the nickname and what people on the street were referring to when they used the nickname were three things. And so I'm going to lay them out really quickly. And you'll pardon my dog in the background if you hear her again. The first was that Black majority. DC became the first major American city in 1957 to gain a Black majority. And that was primarily because of massive white out-migration from the city and massive Black in-migration to the city. And so in the 20 years after World War II, approximately 300,000 white DC residents left, dropping the white population from 500,000, well over 500,000, all the way down to 200,000 or so. At the same time, about 200,000 African Americans moved into the city because the suburbs were segregated. And so they had to move into the center city. And so you get this huge X that you see in the middle of your screen right around 1957 that allows African Americans to become the majority. Now, we know from recent history, particularly the history of, say, Ferguson, Missouri, that a Black majority does not a chocolate city make. Ferguson, Missouri is about 80% Black, but it's a horrible place to be an African American. The cops harass you. The city government is run by a relatively hostile white political class. And so what else did DC have that makes it the chocolate city? Well, the first thing is that it was bursting with Black culture during this period and Black politics, but I'll start with culture. You had the largest Black bookstore in the entire country, established by a bunch of former college kids from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Drummond Spear Bookstore. It was right up off of 14th Street in Columbia Heights. You had DCPS music teachers like Roberta Flack cutting classic albums right on top of a gay bar on Pennsylvania Avenue called Mr. Henry's, which is still there. You can actually eat in the area that's pictured in this album cover that you see in front of you. And again, she was a music teacher. Like there's kids in DCPS that just remember her teaching them how to sing. you had one of the most important and influential independent Black theater companies in the country, in the Black Repertory Theater on Georgia Avenue, which is now the Colony Apartments. But Sweet Honey in the Rock was founded there. The famous a cappella group, Bernice Reagan Johnson, who's a founder of the group, was just the vocal coach for the Black Rep. And then, of course, you had people like Chuck Brown, the godfather of go-go, creating an entirely new musical sound right on the streets of DC, either at the Maverick Room or at the Pitts Motor Hotel or wherever he was playing with the Soul Searchers. Now, on top of all that, you had African Americans who were sort of creating an entirely new Black identity in the city. And that was pretty similar to other places as a product of the Black Power movement. But DC, you had such a concentration of this type of activism. So for instance, in 1972, the picture at the bottom of the screen, DC had the largest African Liberation Day parade in the entire country. And it held that parade consistently in Malcolm X Park, right off of 16th Street, for the following 20 years, 22 years to be, I'm sorry, I did that wrong, 18 years to be exact. And so it was bursting with Black culture as well. But on top of all of that, and perhaps most importantly, you had a Black majority, you had a city bursting with Black culture, but you also had a city that was gaining democracy for the first time in a century. And we have to remember that back at the end of Reconstruction in 1874, Congress stripped the city of any vote whatsoever. Nobody could vote. You couldn't vote for dog catcher in Washington, D.C. In the 1890s, 1920s, et cetera. But slowly but surely over the course of the Chocolate City years, Congress is passing bills, oftentimes at the strenuous urging of local activists, to bring democracy back to the nation's capital. So in 1968, just a few months after the 1968 revolt, we get our first local elections in 90 plus years with the school board. In 1971, we get a non-voting delegate for Congress, and that's of course Walter Fauntroy, the gentleman in the dark suit that's holding up Marion Barry's hand in the picture that you see in front of you. Marion Barry actually ran for school board in 1970, and so you see him, this is his first major elected office in this picture that he's celebrating. And then amazingly, in 1973, Congress votes to give the city a mayor and a city council, something that activists, home rule activists, had been pushing for years. And so all of a sudden, you had a Black-led government here in Washington, D.C., because almost all of these seats are filled with African Americans. But more than that, almost all of these seats are filled with African American activists from the civil rights and the Black Power movements. Walter Fauntroy was Martin Luther King's lieutenant in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Marion Barry was a founding member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And if you looked at the city council when it was first seated in 1975, a supermajority, 11 of the 13 members of the council, were civil rights, Black Power, or anti-poverty activists. The council president at the time, a former activist himself, said, you know, look, and this is Sterling Tucker, for those of you who know his biography. He said, look, you know, everybody came into the council and they were talking about taking it to the man and fighting the system. And I had to stop and I had to say, guys, you are the system now. You are the man. Like, start passing some laws. And they did. They passed some of the most progressive legislation in the country. And in 1975, Marion Barry was actually elected the first. He was the first former Black Power activist elected to the mayorship of a major American city in the United States. Now, that's a great story. It sounds really wonderful. And our editors looked at us and said, "We love it. We love that you're really excited about this period of time between the mid-1960s and the late 1990s. But you're trying to write a 400-year history here. What about the rest of that time? What about the other 340 years?" And our argument to that editor, my argument to all of you, is that DC has always been a chocolate city, always. If you look at it, and I'm sorry, if you all could pardon me for just one moment. It looks like okay, I'm good. So keep in mind that DC has always had a very large Black population. It's built up as on top of a plantation society. The area around where Washington, DC was plotted was prime plantation land. And so the moment that the federal government selects the area to be the nation's capital in 1790, there's already a 20 to 25% Black population in the area. Even the middle of downtown, right where the wharf is today, was the center of the Notley Young plantation. Notley Young was a city father. He had a great deal of money, and he owned approximately 250 African-American enslaved individuals who worked his farm. And so that's what the city's built atop of. And so it already has this built-in large Black population. And at no point in the city's history does the Black population dip below 20%, even with very large Black in-migration in the early 19th century, pardon me, in the mid-19th century. Does the Black population dip below 20%? It dips to 19, right? And so it never gets that tiny. And because of in-migration after the Civil War in the 1890s, DC has the largest urban Black population in the entire country, bigger than any other city that you can think of, at about 90,000 people. And then, of course, in the 1950s, as I already mentioned, DC becomes the first major American city with a Black majority in 1957. So there's always this large Black population in the city that the city fathers, even white city fathers, even when they're in the majority, think a great deal about when they're making policy. The other reason we argue that DC is always a chocolate city is because it's a beacon of freedom to African Americans in the region, even during the years of slavery. When there's slavery in the district, it's a beacon of freedom to African Americans and kind of a capital of Black America. So even during the antebellum period in the 1830s, DC is one of only 3 cities in the entire United States of America where a majority of the Black population is free. And so in about 1833, the free Black population exceeds the enslaved Black population in the city, and it just keeps growing until the eve of the Civil War. On top of that, during the Civil War, the federal government channels a huge amount of resources to African Americans. It builds Howard University, it builds Freedmen's Hospital, it builds a Black school system where Black teachers are actually paid the exact same amount as white teachers in the white system. And so you get a tremendous amount of Black affluence in Washington, DC, that, unlike in other parts of the South, is not stripped away from African Americans at the end of Reconstruction. They're by and large able to maintain that wealth into the early 20th century. And in the late 20th century, you even have the advent of this Black government under Marion Barry and many of these other civil rights activists, and the federal government's adoption of affirmative action that transfers a huge amount of resources to African Americans in the late 20th century. And so one of the reasons that DC and its environs are some of the most affluent areas for African Americans in the country is because the local government, and to a lesser extent, the federal government, were actively transferring resources to African Americans as sort of recompense for those moments when it was in fact taking resources from African Americans, say during the era of segregation. Now, why should anyone outside of DC care about DC history? And this is my last issue. So the first thing is that DC is a national stage. It's the place where the pageantry of American democracy takes place. And it's also the place where sort of actual nuts and bolts American democracy takes place. A great example is the March on Washington, but we have to remember that the March on Washington of 1963 is part of this sort of long line of bringing protests to the National Mall and to the district. So you can think about the bonus marchers during the Great Depression, Coxey's Army before that, who were demanding relief from the Depression of the late 1890s. And you could go on. It's also just a place where the actual physical structure of the federal government is. And so the Congress, the White House, the inaugural parades all happen here. And so the actual pageantry of American democracy takes place on the streets of the district. And because they live here, DC residents tend to have a bit more access to that pageantry, at least as disruptive spectators. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the question and answer if you'd like. But there are two other reasons that people outside the district should care about district history. And quite frankly, I think they're more important. Let's remember that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority of quote unquote exclusive legislation over the national capital. In other words, Congress is in charge in the nation's capital. And what that means is that issues of national policy, issues that come before Congress, issues that Congress is concerned with, consistently end up impacting the district because Congress has carte blanche to do what it wants here. And so the district becomes two other things. The first is a battleground. You have all of these different congressional battles over policy across the history of the city that constantly sweep across the district. And so I'll use the example of the interstate slave trade to make my point here. And that's, of course, what's pictured in front of you. Washington, D.C., and this is at a time when Alexandria was still part of Washington, D.C. in the 1830s, is probably the largest slave exporting port in the United States of America. And of course, it's exporting slaves into the cotton kingdom of Mississippi and Arkansas and all of those other places. And that's because, the tobacco that had dominated the area is being switched over to grain. Grain requires far less labor. And so you have all these slave owners in Maryland and Virginia who have excess labor and want to make some money. And so they sell these people down the river. And they end up in New Orleans and Mississippi and all of these other places. And so that is an embarrassment to those people in the federal government who are anti-slavery. It's even an embarrassment in some ways to some slave owners because slave owners themselves think of slave traders as a little bit less scrupulous than they are. And so there's a huge move in the 1830s on the part of abolitionists to get rid of the slave trade in the district. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, says that DC, if we can end the slave trade in DC, we'll be able to end it all across the South because it'll be a symbolic victory that will be able to spread. And so he calls it the first citadel to be taken in the longer war against slavery. And proponents of slavery and the slave trade were just as insistent that the slave trade in DC must be maintained. And so John C. Calhoun, the famed proponent of slavery and stone cold racist, argues that the district is the South's Thermopylae. If we can stop the abolitionists here, then we'll be okay. But if we can't stop them, all is lost for the South and for the slave cause. Now, the last thing that DC is a laboratory. And it's another reason that people should care outside of the district about the district's history. Again, Congress is in charge. And so when members of Congress want to try out a policy, but they cannot muster enough votes to get that policy implemented nationwide, what they end up doing is trying it out here in the district first. And sometimes in some of the territories in other parts of the nation or of our holdings as a nation at different points in time. But they'll try it out in the district oftentimes, particularly if they want to try out urban policy. And probably the most stark example of this, particularly for people who lived in downtown DC in the 1950s, was the advent of urban renewal. Urban renewal was a policy that was basically cooked up by city planners who believed that, look, the older housing gets, the more likely it is that people with money will eventually move away. And then the place where that older housing is will slowly die. And when people looked out from the balconies of the Capitol at Southwest DC, the entire quadrant of downtown, they saw aging row houses. It was one of the oldest parts of the city, populated by 75% Black population, right? Many of them poor and working class. And so they said, look, we got to get rid of this blight. And they actually called it blight. And if we get rid of it, we'll be able to build a middle-class neighborhood of bureaucrats and primarily white people who will be working downtown. And white people will want to start coming back to the city because, of course, one of their main concerns was white flight to the suburbs during this period. And so the bulldozers rolled in and they demolished an entire community, 23,000 people, again, 75% of them Black, and just laid waste to it, rebuilt it as middle class, middle income properties. And many, white collar laborers who worked for the federal government moved in afterwards. And so the neighborhood after urban renewal flips from 75% Black and poor to 75% white and middle class. If you ever drive through Southwest, you'll know that it looks nothing like the rest of the city. It all looks like it's built in the 1960s, and that's because it was. And of course, urban renewal, I should just point out, spread to pretty much every other urban community in the country after it was tried out here in DC. Now, let me really quickly tell you about my favorite story, because I think I've gone over time just a little bit, or at least the time I'd set out for myself. And I figure, I have different favorite stories, but I might as well go ahead and talk about statehood, because it's on everybody's lips these days. And so I'm gonna preempt some of your questions and just go ahead and talk about it. And so you all know that in 2016, Mayor Muriel Bowser decided to really sort of dive into the statehood cause. And that was a bit odd. Mayors have typically not been sort of active advocates for statehood outside of just supporting someone else who was advocating for it in the city from about the 70s up until Mayor Bowser jumped in 2016. Even Marion Barry, who's very well associated with statehood, really didn't jump in with 2 feet. He let Walter Fontre do most of the work in advocating for statehood in the 80s. But Mayor Bowser decides, we're going to do a really quick constitutional convention where we're going to write a new constitution. We're going to throw it on the ballot. And then if Hillary Clinton wins in 2016, then we'll have and Democrats take the Senate, and we'll have majorities that we need, and we'll go ahead and put statehood on the ballot, and we'll get it. We'll become the 51st state. Of course, none of that happened. Republicans took the Senate. Donald Trump became president, and the statehood cause was dead in the water. I guess the one good thing to come out of that election was that 86% of DC residents voted to support statehood. And so district residents sort of regrouped, and going into 2019, the last year of Donald Trump's first term, so we understood at the time, statehood legislation passes the House, first time in the history of the country. It was very exciting. And a lot of members of the GOP said, well, what about retrocession? And nothing really came of it. And then now in 2021, statehood legislation has again passed the House. It is now before the Senate, where it has 45 co-sponsors, a remarkable number, again, another record. And many members of the GOP are saying, well, what about retrocession? For those of you who watch the Sunday news shows, you'll know that Susan Collins and Mitt Romney said, I don't want statehood, I favor retrocession on the Sunday talk shows just a couple of days ago. So let me really quickly talk about retrocession and why DC residents don't want it, because many of you are residents of Virginia because of retrocession. And if you look across the history of the city, there's really 3 ways that you can get a vote in Congress without moving. One is retrocession. It was tried and it was successful in Alexandria in 1846. The other is a constitutional amendment. It was tried. It actually was passed out of Congress in 1978. But unfortunately, it died before the states in 1985. And so that was tried and it failed. And the latest one is statehood, which has been tried twice now and actually come out of the House. And it's unclear if it will in fact be passed. And of course, primarily because Joe Manchin has said he's not going to change the filibuster, and Mitch McConnell has said, I'm going to filibuster it. So why not retrocession? It worked for you guys. Why wouldn't it work for DC residents? And the simple answer is that you all know the story of retrocession, so you kind of know the answer. The reason that Alexandria retrocedes from the district is initially because they thought they were going to get a financial windfall from being part of the national capital. Everybody thought that there was going to be a financial windfall for being part of the national capital when Maryland and Virginia ceded land for the national capital. But Congress banned the building of federal buildings on the Virginia side of the Potomac to make sure that George Washington didn't enrich himself, because he had all types of land holdings all up and down the Potomac. And so they said only federal buildings can be built, federal buildings can only be built on the Maryland side. And so all of a sudden, Alexandria residents realized that they're not going to see a windfall from federal building. Then after the War of 1812, they don't see the big windfall of building that happens in Washington City after that war as well. And so starting in the 1820s, they demand retrocession back to Virginia. They're just like, look, we're not getting anything out of this. And we don't have rights. We don't have anyone representing us in Congress. Using the language of the time, they said we are slaves to our congressional masters, which was, of course, looking back, quite ironic since it's a huge slave trading port. And they Congress ignores them in 1820 because it can ignore anybody in the federal district, then and now. But they try again 20 years later, and they try again 20 years later, primarily because abolitionists are targeting the city to get rid of the interstate slave trade. And they're worried that they're actually going to succeed in ending the slave trade in DC. And slave trading is Alexandria's biggest business in the 1830s and 40s. So they want to protect it. They also know that slave owners in the Tidewater region, further down in Virginia, are looking for more votes in the House of Delegates in Richmond. And that's because you have all of these upcountry, non-slave holding whites, the people who would eventually become West Virginia, who are hostile to slavery because they don't have slaves, right? So they need more pro-slavery votes in Virginia. So you have folks advocating in Alexandria to want to get out. You have folks in the state legislature who want them back. And both of them together convince members of Congress to give the Alexandria side back. It all happens in 1846, very rapidly. But for many DC residents looking across the water at that since the 1960s, when statehood really became an issue in the district, that smacks of slavery. And so for a majority Black and now a plurality Black city, retrocession just doesn't seem like a good idea because of that reason. But more importantly, there's the other problem that DC residents have never asked to retrocede on the Maryland side. There's never been a critical mass who've wanted to retrocede in the city. There's also never been a critical mass in the Maryland state legislature who wanted us back. And so there's never been that synergy that you got in 1846 in Virginia. It's never happened on the Maryland side. And the last thing I'll just say is that a lot of DC residents aren't too big fans of retrocession because every time it comes up, it primarily comes up as a way to take the attention away from DC residents' chosen method for gaining representation in Congress. So when the DC Voting Rights Amendment, an amendment to the Constitution, came up, Republicans said we'd prefer retrocession. When Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton and the proud Virginian Tom Davis, a friend of the city, introduced legislation in 2007 saying, let's just give Delegate Norton a vote in Congress. We're not even talking about statehood. We're not talking about an amendment. We're just talking about giving her a vote because she's a non-voting delegate now. A lot of Republicans said we'd prefer retrocession. And today, when statehood comes up, huge numbers of Republicans say we'd prefer retrocession. And so what you also have in DC is a lot of DC residents just believing, these people aren't serious. They're just trying to sort of take our eye off the ball when it comes to statehood. And so Retrocession is sort of this great story that we tell that I think worked well for the white residents of Alexandria. Black residents at the time, by the way, were panicked when retrocession happened because they knew that some of the small number of freedoms that they experienced as part of the federal district would be ripped away. And in fact, all of the Black schools in Alexandria were closed within 3 years of retrocession, and 30% of the Black population left within 3 years of retrocession because of the crackdown from Virginia authorities. And so while we think it's a wonderful story for the book, we know that it's not a good lesson for what's happening now. So I've taken too long, but thank you so much for listening, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you all have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Musgrove. That was a great lecture. And actually, just through reading your book, it's just, I'm a DC native, so it was like a walk through the past and part of my childhood. So definitely remember Chocolate City and the name Chocolate City bumper stickers being everywhere, seeing posters. So yes, this was a really interesting, for me, reading your book was a very interesting, interesting nostalgia trip. We have a number of questions in the chat, but I wanted to start with one of the earlier questions that came in, and it was a question about Walter Washington. And the question was, wasn't he the first Black mayor of DC? And I know the answer, I'll let you answer that question, but yes. I also think that he's kind of a forgotten figure in DC politics, and if you'd like to say a little bit about him.
Yes, he absolutely was the first Black mayor of DC. He was appointed by Lyndon Johnson in 1967. He then won the mayorship in his own right in 1974. And he, I think, was a really important transitional figure. I think a lot of people think, and pardon me if I gave the impression, I think a lot of people think that Marion Barry is the first Black mayor because he's really the first independent mayor. Walter Washington was told by Lyndon Johnson, like, act as though you were elected. He actually says those words. But Johnson is pretty, sort of gun shy when he gets into the mayor's office, and rightfully so. There are a large number of people in the district committees in the House and the Senate who want the city to fail, and not just want it to fail, but actively try to make it fail. And these people control the city's budget. I mean, they're able to veto laws passed by the council. And the federal government still controls things like the courts and the U.S. Attorney's Office. And so it's not like he didn't understand how vulnerable the city was. What a lot of people also don't understand about, and just to give you one example, and I'll point this out. You have people like Robert Byrd, who we famously think of as like this gray-haired, sort of historian of the Senate and kind of like mentor to Barack Obama. Robert Byrd is a former Ku Klux Klansman who just absolutely attacked the city on a weekly basis just to show out for racist white folks back home. Period. And he would literally cut our budgets to the nub and then turn around and say, well, the city can't function because Black people are in charge, right? And so this is the situation that Walter Washington is dealing with. Keep in mind, on top of all of that, that the city is a bureaucratic basket case when he takes over. Marion Barry in 1979 walks into office and says, how many people do we have on the payroll? And nobody could answer the question. And that was because when Congress was running the city, it basically lashed bureaucratically different city agencies to their federal counterparts, right? So the Department of Housing for the city really reported to the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? So and there wasn't a mayor for them to report to initially, right? And so, and Walter Washington slowly began the process of actually creating a city government, but he couldn't move too quickly because of that hostility. And so, just the fact that he could run the city, I think, is an achievement in of itself. And I think we're really lucky that there's a historian at George Mason, Tracy Michelle, I'm forgetting her last name, but she's writing a biography of Walter Washington. I'm quite excited to see what it says. So thank you for the correction there.
No, it's great too. I feel like he does get forgotten about. I mean, everyone remembers Marion Barry. They remember Adrian Fenty, Sharon Pat Kelly, but they don't remember Walter Washington. Another question that you had, and this is another one that kind of will relate a little bit to our Virginia connections. Can you speak a little bit about Edwin Henderson, who founded the first Black basketball team that included Charles Drew, and there's a Virginia connection there. Could you speak a little bit about him?
Oh goodness, I can't. My apologies. Yeah, I mean, when we were writing the book, and I'll sort of give you some insight into the nuts and bolts of this thing. Um, we wanted to chase all of these different, sort of leads. I mean, I think I spent 4 days just looking at the public school private school football game that eventually ended up in a brawl in the mid 1960s, and was then canceled. And Vincent Gray, I think, restarted it a couple of years ago. And it was because it had become sort of a white black competition by that point, in the mid 1960s. I think I spent 3 days sort of digging into that because it was such a fascinating story. And Chris and I would kind of, sit down and shake each other, after we'd come back together and review each other's work and be like, that's not about politics. Like, we have to focus on race and democracy. There's way too much to talk about here. Just stick to the script. And so I can't speak about the basketball team. My apologies.
No, he's just an early founder of Black basketball, for our listeners. And there is a connection to Fairfax County with Mr. Henderson and Virginia. And if those who are interested in pursuing more about it, if you're familiar with Chinner Hill in Fairfax County, you can find more information about Edwin Henderson's life and his role in founding basketball. Another question that we have, and I remembered this, is there any reference in your book to the Foxtrap private club as a gathering spot for the Black Power bases? And believe it or not, I was a kid at the time, but I went to a party at the Foxtrap.
Wow.
I was a member of Jack and Jill, an African American children's organization, and they rented out the Foxtrap. But it has a history in DC, so I'll let you take over.
So I don't believe the Foxtrap is in the book. The Foxtrap is very briefly, as an aside, in the website, the Black Power in DC website, and that's because before it was the Foxtrap, it was the headquarters of Colonel Jeru Ahmed Hassan's Provisional Government of the Moorish Republic, which was sort of the religious arm of his Black Man's Volunteer Army, which is, I think, the more famous group that he's associated with. And so that building, and it's not that big a building, right? But that building has like a very storied history in Black politics and social life in the city. But yeah, I mean, there were even anti-apartheid activists who I think would do events at the Foxtrap to try and get, like, folks that would not normally go to anti-apartheid rallies kind of involved in the, I think that was in the early 80s.
Yeah, and then has this legendary history as sort of like a very elegant private club for African Americans, which was something that we didn't really have in DC. Or we had organizations, but it was sort of to be a member. I remember people who were a member. There was sort of a status for being a member of Foxtrap and being a member of that club. Another question that we have that I find really interesting, and you do discuss this in your book, is about, and I'll read the question. I might be wrong, but it seems that Chinatown and downtown DC may have more Black residents than Chinese residents. Do you know why? I wonder, where have the Chinese residents who used to live in Chinatown moved to, and why Black residents decided to move into Chinatown? And I know you talk about early displacement of Chinese residents in 1931 in your book, and then what happens later. You'd like to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So, the original Chinatown used to be down by where the, oh goodness, what's the name of the museum? The Museum of Modern Art, sort of where the fountain is, it's underground. It was roughly about there off of Pennsylvania Avenue. And it was bulldozed by the federal government to make way for what was supposed to be a municipal center. And then it becomes a park, and then eventually the federal government builds a museum on it. And the Chinese community had to figure out where to relocate after they get pushed out. And so they kind of secretly buy up a bunch of buildings at at 8th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues. Um, and the, the population there gets pretty large by the 1950s, when the suburbs aren't that big yet. There are about 1,500 Chinese people in the city living in Chinatown. But the Chinese, unlike African Americans in the city, were not segregated. Discriminated against, yes, but not segregated. And so Chinese Americans could go to white schools, and the depictions of them in the first half of the 20th century are remarkably, sort of racist and condescending. But nonetheless, the actual policy is that you mainstream them into white schools. And the same thing with housing segregation. Chinese Americans were allowed to live in essentially whites only areas. And it's probably because their population was so small. And so the moment that the Chinese population sort of grows up to 1,500 people, kind of swelled with war brides after World War II, it plummets because the Chinese, those people who were affluent enough headed out to the suburbs. And so by the time you even get to the 1968 revolt, the Chinese population in Chinatown is down into the low hundreds. And then, of course, but it's still got this robust sort of business culture there, right? But the revolt actually puts that a lot of those businesses in bad shape. I mean, people are they're not coming downtown at night at all, by and large, and even the day crowd is pretty thin. Because if you look at pictures of the area, what we now call, I think it's the area around Chinatown, there's a lot of parking lots in the 1970s. It was a lot of sort of clearing but not building. And so the Chinese population, the business owners specifically, tried over and over and over again to sort of redevelop the area as a Chinese themed neighborhood, even though the vast majority of Chinese people are already out in the suburbs, are gone from downtown DC. And the only reason that you have approximately about 300 Chinese people still in the neighborhood today is because of the Wild Luck House and another building, I think it's called Museum Square, both of which have rent-controlled units that are basically designated for Chinese people, at least in the Wild Luck House, as part of the terms of their building. Wild Luck House was built in the 80s under Marion Barry. And you have the themed out neighborhood that actually ends up happening primarily because of the building of the Verizon Center and the incorporation of a lot of those plans that the Chinese business community had created as far back as the 60s. They finally get picked up in the mid 90s, and you get the Chinese street signs, and the arch comes in 86. But the people have been gone for years. And the only folks that don't leave, that are still there, are essentially people that can't afford the suburbs, that are living in subsidized housing.
And even Wild Luck House was under threat recently. I don't know if that issue resolved, but they were talking about displacement of Chinese seniors, I believe.
I believe it was, but I haven't followed it closely. I know Museum Square was under threat. That was, a developer it almost was able to clear the building and redo it. Wild Luck, I'm not that clear on, but Museum Square, there was a real pushback about 3 years ago, not too far after the book came out.
We have a lot of questions. Another question has come in. Can you talk about the AfroAmerican Bicentennial Corporation?
Yeah. The DeForest brothers. So Vincent DeForest and his brother put together a group in anticipation of the Bicentennial that was really all about sort of injecting African-American history into the Bicentennial. And so if you looked at like the National Register of Historic Places, it had very few stops that were designated for African-American history. Heading into the Bicentennial, like the Frederick Douglass House up in Cedar Hill in Anacostia was kind of falling apart. And so Vincent DeForest and his brother really focused on preserving and getting the sort of federal stamp of approval for Black historic landmarks. And so they did fundraisers at the Frederick Douglass House. I mean, really cool stuff. Like they had James Earl Jones come and deliver Frederick Douglass's what is the 4th of July to the slave address from the steps at Cedar Hill, right? And they're of course working with the National Council of Negro Women and other groups that actually bought and fixed up the house. But they're doing a lot of the work with the federal government to give it landmark status. They landmarked, Duke Ellington's house. There were basically 3 landmarked spaces in the district that focused on African Americans. By the time the DeForests were finished, there were like 60. And they're not done. I mean, Vincent DeForest, I spoke to him a couple months ago. He's working with people who are trying to save a Black cemetery in Georgetown today. And that's the female Union Band cemetery that's right on the edge of Georgetown as you head into the community. I think it's on, I want to say N Street, but don't quote me on that. But that is a neglected cemetery that developers were trying to buy from a local church and basically dig up the graves and build buildings on top of it, which, by the way, happened multiple times in Georgetown. Every 5 years or so, you'll get a newspaper article that says, yeah, I was excavating my driveway and we found a body, right? And that's because there were at least 2 Black cemeteries that we know of where developers just built on top of them in Georgetown. They were trying to do it to a third. The DeForests were able to step in and keep the church from selling it, but they've really struggled over the years to finish that work. And so now Lisa Fager, it's actually a good friend of mine, is now heading the AME Zion Church Cemetery Foundation. And so if you all are interested in doing some of that preservation work with her, you can reach out to her on Facebook or Twitter.
We have quite a few more questions. So there's some really great questions here. One of the questions that just came up was it sort of a general question: why does anyone want to live in DC if they're not properly represented?
Yeah, that's a reasonable question. So keep in mind that there's a huge number of people who were born here, and so they're DC natives and they're fiercely proud of where they were born. I'm not one of those people, and so I suppose the question is more directed at me, right? And I just was so attracted to the culture and the politics and the people. And then as I came to find out about it, the history, that I wanted to live here. And so I moved here. It's a beautiful place. But it was mostly that social and political landscape that attracted me here. I mean, this is a place where Frederick Douglass lived. This is a place where Mary Church Terrell lived. I live around the corner from Lonnie Bunch, right? My kids, my kids went to daycare with the grandson of Joyce Ladner, the famed sociologist and SNCC activist and former interim president of Howard University. I mean, like, this is, sort of, for an African-American historian, this is Shangri-La, right? Like, this is the place you want to be. And so that's why I moved here. And why many of those people moved here, I think, is also a really interesting story, which is that Joyce Ladner and probably 30 plus members of SNCC moved here because they wanted to wage a struggle for the vote for Washington, D.C. And so I've tried to sort of dedicate my scholarship to part of that struggle as well, which is why I'm sort of sick of talking about statehood, because Chris and I have just been doing it nonstop for months now. But I think that's what a lot of people are attracted to. But you'll also find among activists like Sammy Abbott, the famed anti-highway activist who became mayor of Tacoma Park, Maryland. He actually lives right across the line in Tacoma Park because he refused to give up his vote and move into the city. I think it's a great question, but I'm hoping that most people will turn it around and say, why would people in this country allow a 68 square mile place containing 700,000 people not to have representation in Congress? I believe it's unconscionable.
No, absolutely. Can you detail more about the impact in Alexandria on the Black community with retrocession, and what time frame did this occur?
Yeah, so 1846, retrocession passes, and so the actual process of retrocession I think it's September 1846 that Congress passes its bill, sort of gives its nod. And so going into the fall and winter, retrocession happens, and that means essentially at that point that slave traders, pro-slavery activists are kind of riding high within the Alexandria political establishment, right? Now, being part of the capital prior to retrocession essentially meant that you were part of you were part of a jurisdiction that had slavery, right? When retrocession occurs, there's probably about 6,000 enslaved people in the district writ large. Go down to about 3,000 by the time you got to 1860. So it's declining rapidly. But being a part of the district essentially meant that you were part of a jurisdiction that is under the stewardship of Congress. And that Congress is divided on the issue of slavery, right? And so there are pro-slavery members of Congress and there are abolitionist members of Congress, or at least people who are hostile to the extension of slavery. I think abolitionists might be a little too, I overstepped there. But what that means essentially is that you're afforded some level of protection. Now, the district had black codes with special laws for African Americans that require that they, give a bond for good behavior when they entered the city. But the district black codes were far less severe than the Virginia black codes, right? Many southern states, in fact, were trying to get rid of free black people altogether. So at the same time that the district black free population is growing, because you get people who will sponsor you and pay, and sort of put up your bond. You get people who will give you a job. You get people who will at least push back if you are too much oppressed in the district, right? That sort of protection goes away. And so the free black community that had grown up in Alexandria under the district government, all of a sudden that community is under threat because Virginia's black codes are quite literally designed to get rid of free black people altogether, right? In DC, it's like, we'll tolerate you, we'll confine you. In Virginia, it's like, we're trying to find a way to get rid of you. Right? And so the idea of free schools, free black schools in Virginia, was just not going to happen after retrocession. And so they're all closed. And you still get a free black population in Alexandria, but it declines pretty rapidly. I mean, between 1846 and 1850, it declines by 30%, right? And that's because, it's not like, you have to make a living, right? And if the elites are hostile to you, if you can't conduct your own business, if your schools are shutting down, if your churches are shutting down, there's just not an option to stay. And so huge numbers of people left. And those people who did stay, their quality of life was degraded over time. That only has to happen for 14 years, but it was a rough 14 years, right? And then, of course, you have the Civil War, and it's a whole nother story. Union troops head into Alexandria. They take the Heights, where Robert Lee's mansion is, which is now Arlington Cemetery. But for that 14 years, black life was quite precarious in Alexandria, and so those who could left.
Thank you for that. And I also want to thank you too, because in our discussion before the lecture, and I want to share with our audience that you have been a dedicated visitor to our Freedom House site here in Alexandria, bringing your classes. And in Freedom House, the former Franklin and Armfield slave dealer business, at 1315 Duke Street, we are now, we own, as the city of Alexandria, we purchased it in March of 2020 at the height of the pandemic, but we are working on a new interpretation for this site that gives rise to the African American voice and tells more of these stories, and will tell them throughout the building. So I just wanted to let our participants know that and be aware of that. Other questions that
I just give a quick plug? I mean, I really, for anyone listening who has not been to the museum, please go and donate while you're there, by the way, but please go. It is one of the best museums for understanding antebellum slave life in the District of Columbia, in the area, period, point blank, right? It's one of the few that has much of the original architecture of the old, the entire house, the old Franklin Armfield house is there. The bars that were on the basement windows are still there. I believe a recreation of the old door that was used as a cell door by Civil War troops who were imprisoning secessionists in the old slave pen is still there. It's a wonderful, wonderful exhibit. And there's nothing that can really help you to understand the precarity of antebellum Black life in Northern Virginia, like a discussion of the slave trade, because the interstate slave trade quite literally meant, for those people who were caught up in it, social death. I mean, it's not like you get to go visit once you've been, your family, once you've been shipped to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. You have a high chance of dying. You have little chance of ever getting back to where you came from. And so people who were sold away in the 1820s and 1830s, it really did seem for them like the end of their lives as they understood it up to that point. And so I encourage you to check it out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that plug. We're actually working on a historic structures report now, so we'll know even more about the architecture of the building. And I also want to give a shout out to the Northern Virginia Urban League, who were so instrumental in creating a museum there in 2008. And I know it's a little bit after 8, but I'd like to go through, if there's time, just through a few more questions, because we've had so many fantastic questions that have come in. So let me scroll down for a few more. Let's see. Oh, one person, since we talked about the Foxtrap, do you remember the exact location of the Foxtrap, the exact address for the Foxtrap?
Oh, not offhand. It's on right off of 16th Street. So if you're standing on 16th Street, it's on the corner. But I don't know what the cross street is. I want to say
it either. Yeah, I only was I don't remember. Yeah.
It might be Q or R Street in 16th, but I don't remember.
I think it's close to.
But if you look at Black Power in DC, little plug there, it is listed. The actual address is listed. It's placed with a pin
on your website for Black Power in DC. Great. Your book does discuss Georgetown a little bit, and we had a question about Georgetown and Black residents there. Did you have more to say about Georgetown and the African American population there?
Yes, we absolutely do discuss Georgetown. Because Georgetown predates the district. It was actually founded as a tobacco warehousing port in the mid 1700s. I think it's actually given a charter maybe 30 years after that. So it predates the district by a couple of decades. And it becomes kind of like the fancy area because it has older, nicer houses. It seems more like civilization to a lot of the early congressmen who come and, there's still trees where the stumps are being ripped out of where, Pennsylvania Avenue should be when they show up in 1800. And so, it grows up a significant Black population early on before the district is located here as well. Because those people are able to gain freedom earlier than many of the African Americans in, say, Washington City, they're relatively more affluent than African Americans in Washington City. And so the sort of the core of affluent DC prior to the end of slavery is in Georgetown. And so, you get a number of churches over there. You get it because those churches, you also get cemeteries over there that sort of speak to a much longer Black past than in other parts of the city because the rest of the city is so young. Georgetown really becomes an interesting sort of part of the book again in the 1920s and 30s when it becomes kind of the ground zero for gentrification, what we would come to call gentrification. At the time, people called it private revitalization. Gentrification was Georgetown was about 30% Black in the early 20th century. It had a sizable Black population. It was very class diverse, and gentrification just decimates it. Black population drops into the single digits by the 1950s. And, and it's just because there's no rent laws. And Black folks are quite poorer than most of their Georgetown, fellow citizens. And so landlords just walk in and say, get out. And they end up in, Shaw or Columbia Heights or Southwest. And, the story of displacement in the city is really a very sad one because you'll find people who were being displaced in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. And they'll say, this is just like when I was displaced from Georgetown in the 50s, right? So I mean, we start in I think the last chapter, we write about a woman who was displaced from her home in Columbia Heights. She actually lived off of 14th and W. And as a child, her family had been pushed out of Georgetown. You can find people that were displaced from all of the projects off of North Capitol and K Street when that was all leveled a couple of years ago under Adrian Fenty. And a lot of them had been displaced from Southwest and had moved into those projects. And so Georgetown comes in and out that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my father is almost 90, and I mean, many of his friends grew up in Georgetown. He remembers going down to Georgetown and remembers that displacement. You definitely talk to older Washington, D.C. residents. You definitely know it. One of our people in the chat did not have a question, but wanted us to make sure we mentioned that the building was previously owned by the National Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. So I do want to get in a mention in there for that. We have so many questions. I'm just gonna take a smattering for just a few more. Could you discuss the large migration of African Americans from DC to PG County? And was there a particular impetus for this?
Yeah, I mean, so, there are people, so there's this great phrase that like historians of the suburbs use to talk about sort of Black villages in rural areas that then get swallowed by suburbs. And they say that, these Black people were in the suburbs, but they were not of the suburbs. And one of the major reasons that you see a huge movement of Black people into Prince George's County after passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 is because there's already about 15,000 Black people there. So there were two Black towns that were established in Prince George's County as kind of suburban, sort of like small towns outside of the city. And a lot of Black federal workers bought farms or small houses there. Kind of as they're outside of the city residents. And those towns grew as like actual Black towns within a larger white county. And so when, sort of white suburbanites headed into Prince George's County in earnest with all these tract homes being built, they kind of surrounded these Black towns, but they couldn't level them. I mean, like Black communities got leveled a lot in DC, but they just didn't have the mechanism to do it, or perhaps the will in the 60s and 70s. And so by the time the Fair Housing Act kicks in and Black people actually get access to suburban Prince George's County, the reason they choose it over, say, Montgomery County or Fairfax is because there's already a robust Black population there. They're hearing word of mouth, and so they sort of build out from those Black enclaves. And the Black population moving across eastern and southern avenues into Prince George's County starts, in earnest in the late 60s. And it, just stays very steady in the 70s because, these Black folks want the same thing that many white middle-class folks want: a little patch of green, nice schools, those things. In the 80s, a lot of those same people not only want those things, but they're fleeing the sort of the drugs and crime epidemic that's enveloping much of the city. And then in the 90s, we of course go bankrupt, and so they're also fleeing, drugs, crime, and a broken bureaucracy. And then more recently, what you get is sort of a working class and a lower class migration into Prince George's County, which is primarily forced. They just can't afford DC anymore. And so they're being pushed across the line, primarily into the garden apartment communities inside the Beltway. And
someone had a follow-up question to the PG. What were the Black towns in PG County? Do you know that you can?
Oh God, I just wrote I just talked about these for a talk the other day, and I can't remember. If you email me, I'll send them to you. But I'm sorry, I don't remember.
And people who really enjoyed your book and think, it's such a great look at Washington, D.C. Are there other books that you would recommend as a scholar for people who want to learn more about Washington, D.C.? Are there books that have informed your scholarship?
Oh, yeah. So, we'll have people come to us when we give presentations like this, and they'll say like, oh, there's nothing out there in Washington, D.C. Thank goodness for your book. And I would say absolutely not. There's tons of stuff out there in Washington, D.C. And since we published Chocolate City, there's only been more, and it's all been really good. For those who are interested in contemporary history, I'd absolutely recommend Locking Up Our Own by Jim Foreman Jr. I'm not the only person who likes it. It got a National Book Award. It's just an amazingly written book, and it's an amazing topic. For those who really like, sort of a memoir style book, I'd absolutely recommend Rosa Lee by Leon Dash, a Washington Post reporter that sort of deals with issues of intergenerational poverty and crack and crime in the city. There's also, oh goodness, for those who like sort of early 19th century stuff, Kate Mazur's two books, Until Justice Be Done, which is primarily about the national Black effort for civil rights prior to the Civil War, but she covers a lot about DC. And then her amazing and field-defining book on Reconstruction in DC called An Example for All the Land. I mean, I could go on, like there's some good stuff out there. But that should get people sort of going pretty well.
Thank you. And just one last question. This has been an amazing presentation. You published the book Chocolate City in 2017. A lot has happened in the 4 years since then. Mm-hmm. Is there one thing that you would have, if you were writing this book today, is there one thing that you have not explored that you would like to explore if you were going to do it today? Or one area that fascinates you still with DC?
Yeah, so, I am, it's sort of a methodological thing. One thing that I loved about Jim Foreman's book was that he really dug into the city council records. And, we were, after a while, Chris and I were trying to move pretty quickly. And that's because, during the time that we had the book, I think we had 3 children between us. Our wives had 3 children, and we were there for the event. We both bought and fixed up older houses. I actually got a new job and went up for tenure. And so things were just crazy, right? As we were trying to write. I mean, at one point I was home with my son, and I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to write until 7:30, right? And then I'd be with him for the rest of the day. And so I really wanted to get into the city council records for the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I just didn't have the time. And so, we were able to find other sources that worked, but they just didn't give us the insight, I think, that James got for his book. And so I really wish we had done that. But as far as topics, no, I mean, we left so many on the cutting room floor just to make sure the book wasn't too long, and it's already very long, right? But I mean, we set a goal for ourselves of 25,000 words per chapter. And I'd sometimes come back to Chris with 40, 50, and then he'd sort of sit there and just, hack away at it until it made good reading. So I think, we were able to get out everything we wanted. It just didn't all make it into the book.
Yeah. No, and you do have so much in the book. And I was even thinking an anniversary happened yesterday, and you talk about this in the book, was the 1991 riots in Mount Pleasant. Yeah. And I think that was sort of the start of sort of seeing the a real forceful emergence of Latino culture and representation in DC. And I think that, this book is such a valuable resource because you learn about so many parts and facets of Washington, DC, and all of the different groups that make up what is really, like you're saying, an incredible place to live. And I think at the end of the book, you challenge your readers with sort of working to make DC more egalitarian, a more fair place to live. And I think that's a great challenge to us, because I think here in Alexandria, and having you for Preservation Month, we are all in Alexandria and DC, we are all looking at bringing more equity to our communities, to our housing. And so I think the work you're doing is so valuable. I think this book is a great resource. It helps you understand how things happen and the way they did. And I think it's really a great resource for us. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And we have wonderful comments in the chat. One was people want to know how to donate to Freedom House, how to acquire more copies of your book and be in contact with you. So we'll definitely save the chat. And I'm just looking at this last question that came in. The person was saying the connection, thanking you for the discussion and talking about the connection to Chinatown during Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and Wallach House residents and advocates let's
Right.
see, are starting to raise capital to buy and keep it affordable for elderly Section 8 Chinese residents, many of whom are moving in with family in Montgomery County and PG, more displacement. So yeah,
Mm.
it's still continuing, it still happens. And I think the best way to talk about is to talk about what is causing this and to make people aware so they're more responsible, I think, in the way we build our cities and our communities. And we make sure that everyone has a place at the table and a seat at the table. So thank you tonight for a great lecture. We would love to have you back again. This was wonderful. And like I said, for me, a walk down memory lane. So I definitely appreciate it. And thank you being a supporter for our Freedom House site. And for those of you who'd like to know more about Freedom House, join us next week on May 11th at 7 p.m. for Dr. Joshua Rothman, who will be speaking on his new book, The Ledger and the Chain, but looks at the slave dealers John Franklin and Isaac Armfield. So we're really, really looking forward to that lecture. And also, again, please visit your website on Black Power and Black activism in DC. So, so again, this isn't goodbye. We will be seeing you again. Many thanks for a great lecture and have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Bye-bye.